Hi, I'm John Mulkins. Welcome to the Peaceful Political Revolution in America podcast. When the national co-chair of the Democratic Socialists of America talks about abolishing the Senate, a lot of Americans panic. It's hard for most of us to imagine living under a constitution other than the one we all know, even though our faith in government is at an all-time low. We are living in extraordinary times, and it's fair to say the framers of our 238-year-old Constitution had no idea what today's society would look like 2 remarkable centuries after they were all gone. Still, they understood, at least in principle, that our Constitution would need to evolve with society, with technology, and with the challenges and discoveries they could never have imagined. George Washington may have declared that the basis of our political system is the right of the people to make and to alter their constitutions of government when done as an explicit act of the people as a whole. But he never explained how that could happen. Surely, the framers were in no rush to make it obvious. They were still shaken from Shays Rebellion, staring down the collapse of the Articles of Confederation, and they wanted stability more than they wanted democracy in 1787. So they gathered themselves in Independence Hall, locked the doors and shuttered the windows, and in secret, sweltering in the heat, built a system designed to secure their role as political elites, one built to restrain the spirit of democracy the War of Independence had unleashed just 11 years earlier. But Thomas Jefferson had his concerns. He argued that the earth belongs to the living, that no generation had the right to bind the next, and that constitutions should be rewritten every 19 years. But Americans have never grappled with the question of how to do that, let alone should they. Today, we'll have a look at what could have been had they taken Jefferson's advice. Beau Breslin holds the Joseph C. Palamountain Jr. Chair in Government at Skidmore College, where he served as Dean of Faculty and Vice President for Academic Affairs. He is the author of the Communitarian Constitution, From Words to Worlds, and his latest book, A Constitution for the Living, imagining how 5 different generations of Americans might have rewritten the nation's most fundamental law. He'll walk us through those imaginary halls of history, the constitutional conventions that might have happened, the amendments that could have been written, and the fate of the Senate, which has outlived every challenge to its undemocratic authority until 2022. It's a fun thought experiment, but a serious one, as it forces us to ask not just whether our political system is working, but whether Americans could ever create the tools we need to fix our Constitution when the Constitution itself becomes the problem. This is my conversation with Beau Breslin. I hope you enjoy it. Please like and subscribe if you find this conversation thought-provoking. Beau, I'm very happy to finally have you on the podcast. Welcome to the conversation, and how are you doing?
Yeah, John, I'm great, and it's an honor to be here. You've had a lot of interesting conversations before this, so I'm just grateful for the opportunity to chat with you.
Yeah, it's great. Me too. And I've been looking forward to this one in particular because you have a remarkable achievement here in this book. So you put together a great plot line for the book, 5 conventions at 5 unique and pivotal periods in our history, addressing the crucial issues of their time. And you create a vivid portrait of the characters behind the conventions and their perspectives, their motivations, and their aspirations. And it's kind of remarkable. And I think it's a really fun read, too. It gave me a sense of how things might have gone had our ancestors been able to address the shortcomings in our Constitution. And it's That's a pretty believable story, actually. So, what inspired you to write the book?
Yeah, so I've always been fascinated by the founding period, John. As you know, much of my career I spent thinking about late 18th century America and the way in which a group of elite white men were able to sort of reshape the globe, quite frankly, and certainly here. And I was in conversation at one point, maybe, John, maybe 2010, something like that, with a student. And we were talking about the famous debate between Madison and Jefferson about enduring constitutions or not. And as you know, Madison always believed that our Constitution ought to endure. He probably wouldn't say the 239 years we're talking about now, but the Constitution ought to endure in order to build up the necessary credibility to make it sort of authoritative. And Jefferson said, nah, that's baloney, right? It's every generation ought to write its own Constitution because to allow a bunch of old dead white men to control the destiny of a nation, the political and democratic destiny of a nation, is just another form of tyranny. So we're having this conversation, and I'm like, wouldn't it be fun if we imagined what those constitutions had looked like if Jefferson had won that debate? And that sort of spun off into, I started to think about it, and I thought, wow, I could sort of make this work in a way that I think is credible and pays some homage to American history throughout time. So it started with a conversation with a student and ended up with a Constitution for the Living book.
Man, you nailed it. I mean, it's a great read, and I recommend it highly. It's entertaining as much as it is informative. But I thought we should talk briefly about constitution making in the context of our founding, and specifically the 1987 convention, because constitutionalism, was a pretty radical idea at the time, was it not?
Yeah, it was. I mean, I will always start any class on this topic, John, or any speech that I'm giving with the claim, which I will defend, that our Constitution changed the world, right? How did it change the world? It changed the world insofar as the idea of designing a written text and sort of having it stable ultimately was a revolutionary and new concept. Sure, there were some state constitutions and the Articles of Confederation, which we can kind of call a proto-constitution because it's really just it's more of a treaty than it is between the states than it is a constitution. Our Constitution in 1787, ratified eventually in 1789, changed the world insofar as we were the only one with a national constitution then, and today all but 3 nations of the world have written constitutions. Now, a lot of written constitutions in the world are not worth the paper they're written on. That said, with the exception of Israel, New Zealand, and the UK, every nation has decided to go the written text route. And I describe it this way. I sort of say, okay, what does a constitution do? Well, it limits government. It sort of sets aspirations for a future. It designs the institutions of government, gives powers here or there. But ultimately, it's setting the rules of the political game before the game starts. And in that way, the US Constitution changed the world. So that was a new idea. And it was a revolutionary idea. It was a remarkable sort of risk on the part of the framers in 1787 to sort of go down that route.
Well, I guess I'm not exactly sure where the idea of constitutionalism came from. Was it Thomas Paine?
Yeah, Paine had a really good definition of constitutionalism. The idea of constitutionalism as in an unwritten form, if you think about it, John, the constitutionalism refers to the fact that you're ordering something, ordering some society. It's ordered in a particular way. That's what constitution means. That dates back to the ancients, right? That dates back to Aristotle and Plato. It's what was revolutionary is not the ordering, because the framers the James Madisons and the Alexander Hamiltons and the Benjamin Franklins of the world were familiar with the ordering of politics, but nobody was really familiar with the national ordering of politics written down and accountable, right? So now politicians are accountable to a piece of paper, a piece of parchment that will tell them what they can and cannot do. It's a game changer when you shift. This is the important part, John. When you shift sovereignty from, say, an aristocracy to a citizenry, right? So when we became we the people and we had a template that government officials had to abide by, you can sort of wave that in front of government officials and say, you're abusing me. That's the game changer.
Right. Yeah. Amazing. I often talk about the War of Independence, and we just had the 4th of July, and everybody's celebrating our our independence from Britain, but I think the other half of the holiday is kind of more important. There's the independence part, but then there's the part that establishes a new government by the people. And it's not like we're out there celebrating the fact that we have this sovereign power over our constitutions. It's that idea seems to be lost on people, as you point out.
Right. Yeah. And I think I always get in trouble, especially now at the 250th anniversary, but I always get in trouble when I sort of provocatively say, the Declaration of Independence is an insignificant document compared to the Constitution. Now, I'm doing it tongue in cheek, right? But ultimately, the Declaration of Independence is basically a letter, right, where we're telling the King of England, King George III, that we're moving on. That has a resonant moment in time. It's super important. It made late 18th century and early 19th century revolutions possible. Lots of nations around the world or people around the world used Jefferson's language. But the Constitution is really the birth of the nation in the way we think of it, right? The Constitution's importance is an everyday thing. You know this as well as anybody, John, that every single day we get up, we're living under this constitutional document that may or may not enhance or subtract from our democracy our ability to be popular sovereigns, to be the consent of the governed, those things that the Declaration of Independence sort of talked about, but the Constitution makes it real. And so the Constitution's importance cannot be understated.
Yeah, I totally agree. So let's get back to the book. You begin on page 21 of the book with, the quote from Madison. I'm sorry, with the quote from Jefferson, writing Madison, "The earth belongs to the living. The dead have neither powers nor rights over it." And I think everybody should read this letter if they haven't. And I will link it in the description in the video, but walk us through the actual exchange, which took place in 1789. Jefferson's letter to Madison proposing a 19-year expiration date on constitutions, and Madison's counter-argument, which I find very interesting, and why you think this is the most consequential debate in American constitutional history that most of us have never heard of.
Yeah, so it's a great, they were buddies, right? To be honest, Jefferson was the mentor and Madison was the mentee. They were a little bit different in age, but Madison really looked up to Jefferson. When Madison's outside of politics, he's an advisor to Jefferson when he's governor of Virginia. So they're buddies. They're good friends. And what happens is basically Madison is desperate, or at least wants some sort of endorsement from Jefferson, who's in Paris. So he ships off a copy of the Constitution. This is shortly after, John, this is shortly after September 17th, 1787, when the Constitutional Convention is done. He ships off a copy of the Constitution, and he wants genuinely to hear what Jefferson has to say. And Jefferson writes back, and he has some qualms about certain things. that are sort of very nitpicky, detaily type stuff. Overall, he thinks it's okay. He doesn't like that there's no Bill of Rights and all that sort of stuff. But they get into this exchange that leads to this 1789 conversation that they're having, in which they are debating in a very gentlemanly way whether or not a constitution ought to endure. And Jefferson says this very famous thing. You read the most famous quote, which is the earth belongs to the living. But Jefferson uses metaphors all the time, as you know. And Jefferson's metaphor is in a different letter. He says to Madison, "Why would we wear a coat that we had as a child when we're adults?" And he says constitutions are the same thing. Why would we live by a constitution that we had in a period of time in which things were very different? The political world was very different. And so what Jefferson wanted was, as I mentioned earlier, he thought it was tyrannical to be subject to a constitutional document written by a bunch of dead white people. And he says famously, I belong to that generation. I know what these people were, and they can make mistakes. Every generation ought to write its own. And then he does this very sophisticated calculation that a generation will turn over every 19 years because that's roughly half the population will die in a 19-year period. I mean, it's very sophisticated. So he thinks we ought to go back into convention. What I say, go back to Philadelphia every 19 years and rework it. I used to be a purely Madisonian guy. I'm like, the Constitution endures. It's great. We love it. I'm now entirely a Jeffersonian. I think we need to scrap this text and start over again.
Wow, you've changed your stripes, huh? That's interesting.
I have.
That's great. It seems like a very obvious thing that we should be able to do this because, they had no idea what the world would look like in 250 years. It's remarkable that more people aren't thinking about it right now. But people may not know that there were 4 constitutional designs on the table back in 1787, right? Before the framers even got to Philadelphia, there were the Articles of Confederation, okay, the Virginia or Randolph Plan, the New Jersey or Patterson Plan, and the Hamilton Plan of Union. And still Madison, as I understand it, was not happy with the outcome in Philadelphia. So we tend to think the framers were like divinely inspired, and yet they really struggled to produce a constitution built to last. Well, wasn't it a bit contradictory of Madison, in a way, to champion longevity over substance when he was pushing for a new constitution just 10 years after the Articles of Confederation were established? It's pretty ironic, isn't it?
Yes, it's absolutely true. But, John, this is the great thing about it. If you had asked Madison, and I'm going to be a little hyperbolic here, but maybe not much. If you had asked Madison whether he believed our Constitution should last 200 years or 239 as it is now, he would think we were insane. I'm willing to say, of course, we don't have any evidence, but I'm willing to say that Madison, even though he's the champion of enduring constitutions, never believed that our Constitution ought to last 70 years, maybe 50, but 70 was really stretching it. So, and remember, we've had roughly 160 state constitutional conventions since 1787, which is roughly 3 per state, which would roughly turn out to be about 70 years per constitution. So what's in our blood, what's in our DNA is not necessarily this Madisonian idea of a 239-year-old constitution, but more a constitution that gets us to a point of credibility, and then we can rework it in a way that I think Madison would have been happy with.
Right. People forget. In fact, I don't know if I really understood it before I started this podcast, that the period was very unstable. The Confederation was basically falling apart, and given the consequences of the United States, dissolving, These guys, were looking at the gallows, really, because they had a lot to be concerned about. They weren't just going to lose their property. They would have been arrested had Britain come back and taken us over again. And
Yeah, they were traitors. They knew that they were traitors.
they were traitors and they knew it. So they wanted a strong national government for the protection as well as the well-being of the country, I suppose. But in general, the idea that this Constitution would outlast, what is it, 10 generations or more? I mean,
At least.
it's unbelievable. Yeah. So you address several issues that arose from our Constitution by imagining 5 conventions taking place over roughly, 200 years. It's a compelling picture of how those conventions might have been organized and how each attempted to address the critical issues of the day. So let's begin, right, with, as you do in 1825. What changes might have been proposed at the convention, and why did you begin there? I mean, Jefferson dies on, July 4th, 1826, a year later. So was that part of your strategy?
No, this was part of my thinking, John, about when to have these conventions, because it would have been incredible in the traditional definition of not credible if I had just picked random times. So what I did was I couldn't conceivably do constitutional conventions every 19 years like Jefferson wanted. First of all, it would have been dreadfully boring because not much happens in 19 years. So what I did was I took the spirit of Jefferson's 19-year constitutional convention, and I took the spirit of it, and I found out what the average lifespan of a citizen, of an American, it probably would have been a white male at the time, was at the time of the convention. And then that's when I plopped my next convention. So in 1787, the average lifespan of an average American was 38 years, which puts me at 1825. In 1825, the average lifespan is still 38 years. That puts me at 1863. It goes up to 40 years. That's 1903. Then it's 50 years, 1953, and the last one is 69 years, which means 2022. That's how I got the numbers. And I'm basing it on Jefferson's idea of a generation turning over and so on. So it's in the spirit of that. Anyway, so I figured that out. Then what I did in writing the book was I plopped myself down and imagined what a constitutional convention would look like in 1825. Who's going to be there? Daniel Webster, for example, is absolutely going to be there, right? He's one of the major figures. They're going to be very interested in presidential elections because they had the disastrous 1824 presidential election where John Quincy Adams is able to sort of maneuver away from Jackson and get the victory. So they're going to be talking about these. My data, John, was I used state conventions at the time, right? State constitutional conventions at the time. And there's a ton of them, especially in some of the years we move forward, 1863 and so on. Because they're talking about issues of power, issues of rights, issues of liberty, issues of democracy, issues of republicanism, and so on. They're just doing it at a local level. So I took their conventions and their debates, and I imagined what the conversations would look like at the national level. And so what criticism I get for the book is that, sure, it's absolutely true that if you imagine what a constitutional convention will look like in 1825, the history will change from that moment on, for sure. But I wasn't smart enough. I'm not smart enough to be able to sort of shape what history will look like. So I took what were historical moments and imagined what the Constitutional Convention would look like with those important historical moments.
What was the main accomplishment of that convention?
Yeah, so in that particular one, the main accomplishment would have been a revoking of the Electoral College.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
Because it wasn't working.
Pretty good. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's great. That's a great place. That's a great place to
Talk
start.
about that.
Everybody, listen up, everybody. That's a great place to start. Let's So I want to unpack that a little bit before we move on to the 1863 convention. Now, how does a political scientist write counterfactual history responsibly? Where's the line between informed speculation and fiction? And how did you decide which real historical figures would populate the story? It
Yeah.
was a great idea, but I love it.
Yeah, and I think that's a totally legitimate criticism, right? So when Stanford University Press published the book, they got a little bit of pushback. And I'll tell you a story about a very quick story. One of the I won't tell you which one it is, but there are three great presidential homes in Virginia, right? Montpelier, Madison's, Monticello, Jefferson's, and Mount Vernon, Washington. I approached one of them and I said, "Would you carry my book in your gift shop?" And the answer was no, because it's speculative history and we only deal with regular history. Okay, fair enough, right? So that's a real criticism, and the test is only, John, is only with the reader. Did I make a compelling argument that these folks would have been at the convention and these topics would have been there? I'll tell another quick story about 1863. It was super interesting. So I'm doing this lifespan analysis, and boom, the third constitutional convention, 1787, 1825, and 1863, is right in the middle of the Civil War. Right. And I'm like, oh, I can't duck that. Right. It's a terrible time to be writing a constitution, is right in the middle of the Civil War. I can't duck that. And in fact, I always did it in the summer of that year because I was always trying to be consistent with what they did in Philadelphia. But in the summer of 1863, Robert E. Lee's Confederate forces are right across the border, and Philadelphia is not a great place to be convening to do a constitutional convention. So I call up Alan Guelzo, this great historian. I didn't know him, and I'm like, where would they have it? They're not going to have it in Philadelphia. Where would they have it if this were all true? And I said, would it be Boston or New York? And he says to me, no, probably Columbus, Ohio. Right. And I'm like, whoa, Columbus, Ohio. He's like, yeah, Columbus, Ohio, Ohio's the third most populous state, and they would have given a nod to people on the west of the Appalachia, right? So my point in telling that story is I can get a lot of these things wrong, but it's up to the reader to decide whether I make a credible argument about who would be there and what they would talk about.
Well, I wish it was art history. Let me put it that way. It was that convincing to me. I
Right.
thought it was really bold of you to suggest a convention might happen in 1863, and in the middle of the Civil War, rather than at the end of it. And I've often thought there should have been a convention as soon as the war was over.
Yeah.
But what was your rationale for choosing that year again, and how did that convention play out?
Yeah. So that. The reason why it ended up being 1863 is, again, 38-year lifespan at 1825. So I had to plop it in the place. I had to be consistent. I couldn't function. And one of the things I was thinking about when I was writing it was, is it possible that they would delay it? And the answer is probably yes, right? They probably were going to delay it. One of the interesting things is, as you know, I'm writing about the convention, and Abraham Lincoln really would have no major role, no official role. He wouldn't have been presiding officer at the time. He wouldn't have done any major things. So it's interesting to think about what his position is. So I have them moving up to Boston and doing it in Boston. The most important, and I think this is credible, right? The most important outcome of the 1863 convention is what would have been a grouped together 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, right? So they were talking about that. They were talking about emancipation at the time in 1863. They were talking about equal protection and due process and privileges and immunities. And they were talking about voting for the freed slaves. So those three things would have happened. They would have at least had a conversation about it. And remember, last thing I'll say on this topic, remember, the only people going to the 1863 Constitutional Convention are Northerners. So they would have been much more the moderate, even the moderate Republicans or the radical Republicans would have been much more willing to give a constitutional clause that included the language of 13, 14, and 15.
Yeah, I mean, it's really a bold thing to imagine a constitution, a convention in 1863 when the Confederate States had already petitioned to secede. But,
Yeah.
I would have guessed that the new Constitution might include some of the clauses from the Constitution of the Confederate States of 1861, as a kind of a compromise position. But your convention addressed issues related to, as you said, emancipation and freedmen's rights and apportionment and loyalty oaths, which I'm not quite sure what those are. But how was the issue of secession addressed in your fictional convention of 1863? Did it even come up?
What I say in the piece is that it's a little bit performative for the imagining what it would have looked like to invite those states that had seceded to the Constitutional Convention. But they would have done that, right? The Lincoln will always argue, and Lincoln was the driving force of the Republican Party. He may not have been on the radical side. He was much more moderate, but he's a driving force of the Republican Party. And he never believed that he didn't never argued that the Union was fully broken. So he would have encouraged the convention delegates to Congress, in this case, would have invited Southern states. They just wouldn't have shown up. So you may be right that there are some elements of the Confederate Constitution of 1861 that probably would have been helpful. This is the fun of this of the book idea, whether I'm successful or not, is that we can debate whether or not I got it right or they would have done things differently. I love doing that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the surrender at Appomattox, you would think after that, the opportunity to come together, as it were, and really devise a political system that would satisfy all the states and all the people, more importantly, was a tremendous lost opportunity. I keep looking back at that and I think, wow, what we might have accomplished. I mean, and I said many times before that, the Senate was sort of a creature that came about because of slavery. It sort of, it protected slavery up until the point where there were more free states. And then, a war broke out because the South no longer had the safety and protection of the Senate.
Yeah,
That's my view of it, right? And
I think you're right.
Yeah, and so like at that point, you would think that they would have realized that this was more about monopolies almost than it was about apportionment. I mean, the agrarian monopolies of the South, with the free labor force essentially was being protected, and the North, as I understand it, the North was not necessarily like against it on moral grounds. They were against slavery more or less on economic grounds, right?
Yeah.
After the end of the war, the Civil War is over. What happens is you have the Gilded Age. I mean, this is kind of very raw evidence that the Constitution, the Senate in particular, was instrumental in, proliferating these monopolies.
Yeah, and I think you're right. Let me ask you a question, because what you just talked about is spot on, and it generates a follow-up question for me that I'll ask you. If it's true, and it is true, that constitutions around the world and in the United States, constitutions are written on the tail end of legitimate crises, right? So but very few people, John, write constitutions in completely calm and sedate times. They write constitutions because they're trying to let go of a past and usher in a new era. If that's If that's true, and that is true, think about Eastern Europe, think about all the constitutions that have been written in our lifetime. Civil War, definitely. Where else are we at such a crisis moment in American history post-Civil War where a new constitution would have been a good idea?
The 1903 convention that you imagine, I think, is the one is the most obvious place. I mean, that was a good pick in my mind.
Yeah, I think that I don't think that one's quite as that one maybe not quite as robust, although economic disparity, right? The difference between the haves and the have-nots was huge at that time. So,
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump ahead and say right now would be a good time to have a convention.
and I think now we should talk about that. But I think post the Depression would have been a good time to have a constitutional convention. So, mid 30s or something like that. And in some ways, people will argue. In some ways, FDR ushered in his own constitutional convention. He just didn't change the text. But I think even post civil rights movement up to Vietnam is a period of great disruption in the United States and would have been a good time, especially if you add Watergate to it. So the period of the 60s through the mid 70s, we were unsettled, some for good reasons, civil rights movement, some for not so good reasons, Vietnam and Watergate. That might be a very good time to rewrite the Constitution.
Yeah, I mean, Jack Goldsmith's book After Trump, talks about executive power, for example. You mentioned Nixon. I mean, this is these are glaring problems, and Americans complain about it constantly, but they don't connect it to the constitutional text and the structure of government that we have, which is basically, I would say designed, as several of my guests have said, to protect property and the individual accumulation of wealth, exemplified very nicely by our current resident in the White House. So it's unbelievable.
If we were to sit down with, and we were able to figure out, John, what is a good and decent number of citizens who could write the Constitution, I would say 535 is fine. We'll probably do it over Zoom or whatever. If we could do that today, I guarantee a couple things, right? So one of the things I guarantee is that we would move away, and this is doubling down on what you just said, we would move away from the idea of aristocracy as the dominant feature of American politics. People think we're a democracy, but we're not. We're a republic. And a republic is closer to aristocracy than it is to a democracy. I think we would be a much more democratic institution if we rewrote the Constitution today. I think there would be things like protections for the environment if we rewrote the Constitution today. That's super important, and most constitutions around the world have environmental protections. I think as AI starts to dominate the mainstream, I think you have to consider things like universal basic income for those people who are going to be out of a job, or for everybody. These are the types of things we would do to rewrite the Constitution today, because are we in the same crisis that they were in 1787? No, but we're just as unsettled today as they were in 1787. And that's the time when you rewrite the text.
Yeah, the 1903 convention is the first of the imagined conventions. You include delegates of color, right? Booker T. Washington and Quanah Parker among them. So, but still no women. What does it mean that this convention takes up women's suffrage cause, even as it's simultaneously navigating a hidden, Southern strategy to dilute the black vote? How do you come up with a script where genuine progress and quiet backsliding are, happening at the same time? Pretty good.
Because as you know all too well, yeah, these people are human, right? They are, and I mean that in a sort of honest and facetious way. They're in it for themselves. So when you think about what would have been, sure, how would we introduce in 1903, how would we introduce people of color into the Constitutional Convention? Well, Booker T. Washington is a perfectly good example because Alabama at that time needs to sort of move away from its incredibly racist Jim Crow reputation. And Booker T. Washington, people know, no disrespect to Booker T. Washington, one of the great Americans, but Booker T. Washington is not going to upset the apple cart, right? He's not Frederick Douglass or anything like that. So he's not going to upset the apple cart. So it becomes clear that Alabama gets something out of it by inviting Booker T. Washington to be a delegate. As for the women's vote, the women delegates, we're not there yet. No. There's this somehow women are less intelligent or moral or whatever. It's this ridiculous argument. We're not there yet. But as you know, there were many men who drove the women's suffrage movement, or at least were partners in the women's suffrage movement, and they absolutely would have had a conversation about it because it fulfilled their interests. I say in there, yeah, you've got these white men and two people of color. You got these white men who think they can get their wives to vote for the same person they want to vote for. Why would they not want to add the women to the rolls? So it's that sort of conversation. But at the end of the day, delegates to a constitutional convention, especially political officials, are often just in it for themselves.
Right. Well, again, just a remarkable story that you're weaving in this book, and I can't recommend it enough because it is, like I said, very informative and also just very inspiring and enjoyable to read and imagine this stuff. So I love it. So let's move on to the 1953 convention, because this is the first one that includes women delegates, and yet the document it produces ends up being like the longest, I guess the most minutely detailed constitution of all of them that you imagine. And so, how did adding representation produce, more specificity rather than more clarity, right? And then the Cold War and McCarthyism as a backdrop. How did questions like federalism and unanimous state ratification play out?
Yeah, so this is part of the fun of this, John, and I'm glad you liked it because I had a blast writing this. I was really it was a very joyful period of my professional career because it's storytelling, and at the end of the day, I'm old enough and more senior in my career that all I want to do is tell stories, and this was a good way of telling stories. So the 1953 convention is interesting for a number of different reasons. The 1953 convention, it's true, talking about the detailed analysis, the details of a constitution. Today's constitutions are on average across the world and at the state level. Today's constitutions are on average anywhere between 70,000 and 100,000 words, right? Super detailed. Our Constitution from 1787 is 4,400 words, right? It's roughly the same size as not even an Atlantic article, like a People magazine article, feature article. It's 4,400 words.
I get text messages that long.
Yeah, exactly, exactly right. So, and it used to be, John, it used to be that the brevity of our Constitution was a virtue. Because governments, FDR could get us out of the Depression, and institutions could kind of work in those absence spaces and so on to make Americans' lives better. Now it's a vice because you have governmental institutions that are taking advantage of those open spaces. So, and now in 1953, because of the nature of development and the post-FDR era, they would have wanted to spell out a lot more. So the Constitution would have read more like a legal code than it would have read like a constitutional document like our 1787 document, because that's what happened. That's what happens all around the world and in the States.
Got it. Yeah. I mean, people shouldn't mistake a lengthy constitution for big government, is what you're saying. Right. And I've looked at some of these constitutions, and it doesn't take a lot of effort to get an idea of what you're talking about here. I recommend people go to the Constitute Project website and have a look. Take a look at the South African Constitution, or like Norway's, ranked number one on the Democracy Index. Have a look at that Constitution, or Sweden's, or New Zealand's, and see how it compares to ours. And like, I don't know how many sentences are in our Constitution about immigration. Do you happen to know? Was it two?
At most, and
Two,
you'd
two,
have to
yeah.
you have to have a stretch of interpretation to get to two.
Yeah, yeah, and the famous gun amendment and all that stuff. It's just like, it's just kind of laughable that we are still using a constitution that was basically written on a fancy napkin.
That's right.
It's just unbelievable to me.
And and don't forget, I mean, there's so many interesting things going back to 1787. Madison, Hamilton in particular, but Madison and Hamilton warned us about this by saying, if you write down a Bill of Rights, it's going to be dangerous, because ultimately it's going to be that only those things, only those protections that are written down at a fixed moment in time are the ones that you can be guaranteed. That's not true. And all we have to think about is the right of privacy. Did they think about the right of privacy in the way we think about it now as a issue of abortion and so on? No, but that's the nature of a more perfect union. We're trying to get to a more perfect union, and Madison and Hamilton thought it was dangerous to do it, but they got outvoted.
Yeah, you need more than one chance to get it right. I mean, this is a big project, the American project in democracy. And people, as you say, point out that we are a republic. Lessig has said on many occasions that that's a kind of a false binary, republic, democracy, blah, blah, blah. And I've seen on our government website that our own government, at least on the Clybourne website, it says that we are a federal representative democratic republic. So there's
we'll throw every concept into it.
Pull it all in there together, but in the end, you can't argue with the fact that these guys were rather brilliant. And look at the writing. I mean, these guys were amazing people. I get chills when I think about the way that they approach these topics and these issues. It's just they are remarkable people, but were they perfect? No. Were they divinely inspired? No. Were they absolutely correct? No. And they knew it.
Right. And I hate to be facetious, but they were largely drunk most of the time, because they did a lot of the work in these taverns. They did a lot of the conversation in these taverns, and that was part of the culture at the time.
Yeah, well, God forbid that if we have another convention, everybody is stoned, but I wouldn't be surprised if half of them were, but I would hope not, actually. So, look, this is a chapter where the book's whole premise stops being safely historical. For the convention of 2022, you use real living people. The counterfactual stops being like a costume drama about the past and becomes a direct provocation about the present. They debate a crowdsourced delegate selection process, proposals to reimagine the undemocratic Senate, which I think is spot on, a shift to the single 6-year presidential term, a new third chamber of Congress called the National Assembly.
Mm-hmm.
You had to imagine real living people making these choices. So how did that change the nature of the exercise? And if Jefferson's wager is finally put to living Americans today, do you think we'd take the deal, or is Madison still winning that argument?
Yeah, so I'll start with your first question. The 2022 convention was the hardest one to write. And ironically, it's the hardest one to write, and you and I are living in the moment. You would think that we could write that one pretty easily because we know what's the political environment around us. But it was the hardest one to write for exactly the reason that you point out. It's easy to say, oh yeah, Daniel Webster will be there and he stands for this, and so he would articulate that. Or, oh yeah, Gerald Ford would be the presiding officer because there were political machinations in 1953 and Ford emerges. It's easy to say that stuff. It's not easy when you're talking about the moment, because you can no longer use historical figures, and I had to totally shift my thinking. And so what I did in that moment, John, was I said, okay, I'm going to reach out to some of these major players in American culture and politics and academia, and I'm going to ask them to participate and ask them what they would have been interested in. And so I reach out to Mike Bruni, who is the executive director of the Sierra Club at the time, and I explain to him the situation, and I say, I can't imagine a new constitution that wouldn't have very serious environmental protections. Can you help me by A, participating in my imaginary constitutional convention, and B, helping me come up with a language for what those environmental clauses would look like? And he played the game beautifully. He came up with clauses that you see in the book. And so I had to do that. I did it for a number of different people. I couldn't for others because they wouldn't agree to it. And the one story I'll tell about that before I turn over to your second question is finding a presiding officer was not easy. So all presiding officers, these are the George Washingtons, right? The George Washington was a presiding officer in 1787. I could rationally think of who would be presiding officers at the various conventions. But here, first of all, I thought it was important to have a woman as a presiding officer because there'd never been one, right? And so I started to reach out to, I must have sent, no joke, 700 letters to Ruth Bader Ginsburg asking her, when she was alive, to participate. And she never once got back to me. I asked Michelle Obama. I asked, Condoleezza Rice, people like that. And nobody, and people would get back to me. Condoleezza Rice was super nice. She's like, nah, I can't do that, but that's an interesting idea. Anyway, so finding the presiding officer itself, which, as you know, constitutes like a paragraph in the book. Finding the presiding officer itself was difficult, and then finding the players who were willing to play and what their clauses would look like was difficult too. But I think I did okay. We did term limits for Congress members. I think that's super important. We did environmental protections. We did, Sandy Levinson, who's a great academic, was talking about things like voter recall elections and stuff like that when a president is terrible. So there was a lot of good stuff going on, but finding the people and having them participate was very complicated.
Well, that says a lot about how we feel about changing the Constitution, I suppose. I mean, if it were a more open conversation, an ongoing conversation, I would imagine your response would have been quite a lot different.
Yeah, I think I'm 60, right? And I think I know that there will not be another constitutional convention in my lifetime. Is there the hope of a constitutional convention in my daughter's lifetime? I think the answer to that, John, is yes. Because if we're even if different people are in those positions in Washington, I would say, we're still at a crisis stage where the institutions of government are not representative of we the people. And you see that in the consistently low popularity or polls about confidence in 35% of Americans have moderate level confidence in our justice system. When we were born, or maybe a little bit before, that number would have been at 95%, right? The Supreme Court is political. The current Attorney General is just a lapdog of the current president. So our justice system itself is in the toilet. And the reality is Congress is incapable of doing its, and I'm not talking just Republicans, I'm talking Democrats too, incapable of doing its work because of party as such a major player in American politics. So I think things are going to get not any better. And as a result, I think there will come a moment maybe after my lifetime is over, that a constitutional convention is essential.
Well, I mean, George Van Cleve says, we don't have a government really. Basically, it's so dysfunctional, and people actually have very little representation, if any. They have no influence over what the government does anymore. So I think we're at a tipping point. Whether that is going to take another, 10 or 15 years, more or less, I don't know anybody can say that. But I can hope it's sooner than that. And my own feeling is that, as you point out in your title, the Constitution for the Living, here we are. We're only going to be around for, a handful of more years. And if the living doesn't get on it, then there won't be a Constitution for the living. And I think that would be a real shame.
I'll say one more thing, though, and that is it's people like you, honestly, who are fighting the good fight. And I will say this, John, and that is I have noticed a bigger groundswell of questioning of the Constitution, looking for reform, maybe even overhaul of the Constitution from not only folks like John Mulkins, but also from folks like the popular press. The New York Times runs articles about it. Time Magazine, The Atlantic is very good about it. So there is some interest generated.
Right. Some of the pushback is about a conservative-led convention of states, right? Is the Constitution in jeopardy, as Russ Feingold says? Should we all be concerned about losing our democracy and, rally around the Constitution instead of embracing constitutional change as something that's normal and healthy for a society that is so deeply divided?
Yeah, so that's just window dressing when Feingold says things like that. The fact of the matter is, think about it. If you get the right number of people in the room, in the metaphorical room, well, and I think that's going to be in the hundreds, not 55. But if you get the right number of people, and those citizens are serious, they are representative of the religious, racial, age, all of the demographic stuff, you're going to get a constitution that is small c conservative. There's no way, for example, that if you put people in Philadelphia today, we're going to scrap the three branch system and go with a parliamentary system. It's just not going to happen. If you put 535 conservatives, it's going to look a lot different. But if you do it right, I think the John Mulkins of the world can write a good constitution. And I have faith that you would write a good constitution, or that if I was in that room, we could come up with compromises and so on. You have to pay them. They have to be serious. But ultimately, if you put the right people in the room, and my last point about this, I get fired up about it. My last point about this is if South Africa can do it in the early 90s, when people were angry, bitter, they were pissed off in every possible way. They didn't trust either side, whether it's the Afrikaners or the ANC, whatever. If South Africa can do it and come up with the text that you talked about a half hour ago, we can too.
Are constitutional conventions of the elite, right, versus popular local assemblies of people preferable to a degree? Do we want that? Or what about digital democracy versus representative democracy? And are they both in the cards for the future? Conventions do seem a bit top-down, whereas assemblies like those proposed by Condorcet during the French Revolution, and organizations like Thriving Together and Braver Angels and Unify USA and many other organizations are certainly more democratic. So are both necessary?
Yeah, I think so. So I think they're both necessary, but I think the assemblies you're talking about are more important and more interesting. But I think you have to have a convention, or at least a group of folks who are designated and mandated, empowered to do some textual work, right? Whether it's a committee of detail or a committee of style, whatever it is, there's got to be something that comes out of it. And what's interesting is As you know, because you read the 2022 chapter, Iceland tried to crowdsource its constitution, and it was working fabulously until the legislature was like, oh, no, maybe we shouldn't do it. I'm not suggesting that we should crowdsource a constitution, though I think it would be interesting. And the reason why I'm not suggesting it is not because I don't have faith that people can crowdsource and write a constitution in the same way we write Wikipedia of stuff. It's that it, again, favors the elite, because ultimately those who don't have access to a computer, who don't have the technological knowledge to be able to figure out how to do it, are out of the question. That's why I think you have to have a convention, whether it's digital or whatever, a convention where people are talking to each other as equals. Maybe you do the assembly work first, and then the convention takes what they did and textualizes it. But you got to have a convention where people are seen as equals and can participate in a way that has no other baggage with it.
If you had a seat at the next constitutional convention, let's say it's 2029, to keep the mood optimistic here, what's the first thing you'd change, and what drives that priority in your view? What would you want to see happen?
I mean, the list is long, but I'll tell you the first thing, the thing that I would make sure was mandated into a new constitution, and that's public funding of campaigns. Money is too important and we're not even talking about the Elon Musks of the world who give $185 million to a particular candidate's political action committee. But the fact that the Supreme Court and Citizens United, and then this most recent case, which was maybe a month ago, which said that political parties can spend endlessly on candidates, money is you cannot be a legitimate candidate without a decent war chest of money. That has to change. So if I have one thing that I would change about American politics, it's public funding of campaigns, and genuine public funding of campaigns.
Yeah, well, that goes to the issue of lobbies and climate change. Is our political system a roadblock to solving the climate emergency, in your view?
Yes, I absolutely believe that, because of just what you said, the influence of special interests in American politics is so much, it's an iceberg. Because what most Americans see is only the top of the iceberg, and they sort of throw up their hands and say, that's ridiculous. But the real special interest influence happens below the surface, stuff that we never see. And the any environmental progress we can make is so derailed by what happens underneath the surface in this iceberg that I don't think we'll ever get the type of environmental movement we need in this existential crisis without radical changes to the American political system.
Well said. Thank you so much, Beau. I really appreciate this conversation, and I hope our listeners get a lot out of this and pass it along to everyone as well. So thanks again, Beau, for being part of the conversation on the Peaceful Political Revolution in America podcast.
Thank you, John. It's been an absolute pleasure and an honor, and I so admire the work that you do, and I'm so honored to be in the Zoom room with you.
Well, I'm humbled to hear that. Thank you so much, Beau, and have a great day.
See you later.
What do you think? Was Jefferson correct? Does every generation have the right to ensure its Constitution truly serves them rather than their ancestors? Would that make America a better, more representative nation? If there's one thing I hope you take away from this conversation, it's this. Our Constitution was never meant to be static. It's the decisions we keep making, or not making, that keeps America bound to an outdated and now dangerous Constitution. Whether we admit it or not, every generation that fails to address the shortcomings of their Constitution is simply voting for the status quo. And for most of us, that's not a great bargain. Breslin's imagined histories should inspire us all. They are a reminder that although the framers never gave us a formal mechanism for popular constitutional change, we can, as an authentic act of the people as a whole, do exactly what Jefferson suggested. We need to remember, our acquiescence is not neutral. Someone benefits from the stability of this system, and it's not always going to be the majority of Americans struggling every week just to get by. It's the wealthy, by and large, who somehow end up with most of the benefits. We can't afford to wait for legislative reform. We know how long that might take. The problem is that we are currently trying to solve a planetary emergency with a system designed by our ancestors for a largely agrarian society of 4 million people, conceived before the light bulb was even invented. At some point, the question no longer is how can we switch to renewable sources of energy. The question becomes, is this system of government adequate for our modern, technically advanced society? If a tiny but extremely powerful minority can continually override settled science and the public will without ever being held accountable. Michael Mann is a climate scientist who knows more about the corrosive effects of elite power than he wants to. His new book, Science Under Siege, argues that climate science and truth itself is under a coordinated assault from 5 identifiable forces: plutocrats, pros, petrostates, phonies, and the press. Man has lived this fight from the inside, spending decades on the receiving end of disinformation campaigns aimed squarely at the science of global warming. What he's describing is essentially the flip side of the story Beau and I were just discussing. What happens to a society when they don't address the constitutional flaws protecting the status quo? Michael Mann identifies a funded minority with every incentive to protect that status quo, using every tool available to keep the majority locked out of the decision-making process. They do this using the very same system that protected slavery, that gave birth to the Gilded Age, that led to the endless wars we continue to see, and is now putting the entire planet at risk of a global ecocide. Elites have leaned on this system heavily throughout our history, and that is our now outdated and dangerous Constitution. In the view of many guests on this podcast, we likely won't fix the climate emergency until this generation of Americans begins to take Jefferson at his word. It's time to build a political system that represents all Americans, one that finally gives the people the meaningful exercise of political power to confront the existential threats facing this generation and generations to come. Please join me next time on the Peaceful Political Revolution in America podcast when I discuss Science Under Siege with climate scientist Michael Mann. Until then, stay safe out there.